I smoothed my apron and took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation I knew was coming. George's heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway, and I braced myself against the kitchen counter. "Tara, honey?" His voice was tentative, almost sheepish. "We need to talk." I turned, forcing a smile. "What is it, George?" He stepped into the kitchen, a familiar figure hovering behind him. My stomach dropped as I recognized Adrian, George's brother, the last person I wanted to see darkening our doorstep. "Look who showed up." George's grin was strained. "Adrian's in town and needs a place to stay for a while. I told him he could crash here." Adrian sauntered in, all easy smiles and charm. "Hey, sis! Long time no see." I gripped the edge of the counter, willing my voice to remain steady. "Adrian, what a surprise." George's eyes darted between us, clearly sensing the tension. "It'll just be for a few days, right, Adrian?" "Oh, absolutely," Adrian drawled, already making himself at home by opening our fridge. "Just until I get back on my feet." I'd heard that line before. The last time Adrian had stayed with us, those few days had stretched into months of chaos and drained bank accounts. "George, can I speak to you privately for a moment?" I managed through gritted teeth. We stepped into the hallway and I hissed, "What were you thinking?" "You know how I feel about Adrian staying here." George ran a hand through his thinning hair. I know, but he's family, Tara. We can't just turn him away." "Can't we?" I crossed my arms. "After everything that happened last time?" Before George could respond, a small voice piped up from the stairs. "Dad, who's that man in the kitchen?" We both turned to see our son, Ethan, peering down at us with wide eyes. George's face softened. "That's your Uncle Adrian, buddy. He's going to be staying with us for a little while." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Is that why you and Mom are fighting?" "We're not fighting, sweetie," I said quickly, shooting George a pointed look. "We're just discussing things. Why don't you go say hello to your uncle?" As Ethan padded into the kitchen, I turned back to George. "This isn't over. We need to set some ground rules." George nodded, looking relieved to postpone the argument. We rejoined the others in the kitchen, where Adrian was regaling Ethan with some far-fetched tale. "And that's how I wrestled an alligator in Florida," Adrian finished with a flourish. Ethan's eyes were as big as saucers. "Wow, Uncle Adrian, you're so cool." I felt a pang of worry. Adrian had always been able to charm Ethan, and I feared the influence he might have on our impressionable son. "All right, Ethan," I said, perhaps a bit too sharply. "Time to get ready for bed. Say goodnight to everyone." As Ethan trudged upstairs, Adrian turned to us with that infuriating grin. "So, where am I bunking?" George glanced at me nervously. We thought the guest room would be." "Actually," I interrupted, an idea forming, "the guest room is being repainted. You'll have to take the pull-out couch in the basement." Adrian's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, well, that's fine. I'm not picky." As George showed Adrian downstairs, I allowed myself a small, vindictive smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that night, as George and I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. "George," I whispered, "promise me this won't be like last time." He rolled over, wrapping an arm around me. "I promise, Tara. It'll be different this time." But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder if I was naive to believe him. Little did I know, Adrian's arrival was just the beginning of a storm that would threaten to tear our family apart. A week into Adrian's stay, and our once peaceful home had become a minefield of tension. I stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing dishes with more force than necessary, when George stumbled in, bleary-eyed and reeking of cigarette smoke. "Morning, honey," he mumbled, reaching for the coffee pot. I bit back a sharp retort. "It's 2 p.m, George. Where have you been?" He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "Just catching up with Adrian. Lost track of time." "Lost track of time?" I echoed, disbelief coloring my voice. "You missed Ethan's soccer game. He was crushed when you didn't show up." George's face fell. "Oh, God, I completely forgot. Is he?" "He's in his room," I cut him off, probably still crying. Guilt flashed across George's face, but before he could respond, Adrian sauntered into the kitchen, looking far too chipper for someone who'd been out all night. "Hey, family," he announced, clapping George on the back. "Who's up for a barbecue? My treat." I slammed a plate down, making both men jump. "A barbecue? Are you kidding me? You two have been out God knows where all night, and now you want to play happy families?" Adrian held up his hands. that infuriating smirk still on his face. "Whoa, sis. Calm down. We were just having a little fun." "Don't call me sis," I snapped. "And don't tell me to calm down. This isn't a frat house, Adrian. We have responsibilities here." George stepped between us, ever the peacemaker. "Tara, honey, let's not fight. I'll go talk to Ethan, okay?" As George headed upstairs, Adrian leaned against the counter, eyeing me. "You know, Tara, you really need to loosen up. All this stress can't be good for you." I whirled on him, dish towel clenched in my fist. "What I need is for you to stop disrupting our lives. When are you planning on leaving exactly?" Adrian's smile faltered for a moment. Soon. Just need to get a few things sorted out first." "What things?" I pressed, suspicion gnawing at me. "What are you really doing here, Adrian?" Before he could answer, a crash from upstairs made us both jump. I raced up the stairs, Adrian close behind, to find George standing in Ethan's doorway looking shell-shocked. Ethan's room was a disaster. Books and toys were strewn everywhere, and in the center of it all stood our son, red-faced and trembling with anger. "I hate you," Ethan screamed at George. "You're never here anymore. You're always with him." He pointed accusingly at Adrian. I pushed past George, kneeling in front of Ethan. "Sweetie, calm down. Let's talk about this." But Ethan was inconsolable. "No! I want Dad to go away. I want Uncle Adrian to go away. I hate them both." George looked stricken. "Son, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." "Get out," Ethan yelled, hurling a toy car that narrowly missed George's head. I turned to George and Adrian, my voice low and dangerous. "You, downstairs, now." In the living room, I faced the two men, fury simmering just beneath the surface. "This ends now. I want answers. What's really going on here?" George and Adrian exchanged a look that sent chills down my spine. "Tara," George began, his voice trembling, "there's something we need to tell you." Adrian cut in, his usual bravado gone. "It's not as bad as it seems, I swear. We just got into a bit of trouble, that's all." "What kind of trouble?" I demanded, dread pooling in my stomach. George took a deep breath. We owe some people money. A lot of money." The room seemed to spin around me. "How much?" The number George whispered made my knees weak. I sank onto the couch, my mind reeling. "How?" I managed to choke out. "How did this happen?" As Adrian launched into an explanation about bad investments and unlucky bets, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. Peeking out of Adrian's jacket pocket was a pawnshop receipt. In that moment, I knew. This was just the tip of the iceberg, and our family was headed for a storm that threatened to tear us apart. The pawnshop receipt burned a hole in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that George and Adrian were hiding something far worse than they'd admitted. Over the next few days, I kept my eyes and ears open, determined to uncover the truth. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when I first noticed the hushed phone calls. George's voice drifted from his study, tense and urgent. "We need more time," he hissed. "Just a few more days. I swear we'll have it." I crept closer to the door, straining to hear. "No, don't do that," George pleaded. "We'll figure something out. Adrian's working on it." My heart raced. Who was he talking to? What did Adrian have to do with it? The conversation ended abruptly, and I barely had time to retreat before George emerged, looking haggard and pale. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He jumped, startled. "Oh, Tara. Yeah, just work stuff. Nothing to worry about." But the tremor in his hands told a different story. That night, I lay awake, listening to George toss and turn beside me. Around midnight, his phone buzzed. He slipped out of bed thinking I was asleep and crept downstairs. I followed, silent as a shadow, and watched from the top of the stairs as he met Adrian in the kitchen. "We're running out of time," George whispered urgently. "They're getting impatient." Adrian ran a hand through his hair. I know, but I've got a plan. There's this guy I know. He can get us the money." But what?" George pressed. Adrian hesitated. "It's not exactly legal, George. We'd be taking a big risk." My blood ran cold. What had they gotten themselves into? George paced the kitchen. "I don't know, Adrian. If we get caught—" "We won't," Adrian assured him. "Trust me, brother, it's our only way out of this mess." I'd heard enough. I stepped into the kitchen, making both men jump. "What mess?" I demanded, "and don't you dare lie to me again." George's face crumpled. "Tara, But Adrian cut him off. "It's nothing for you to worry about, sis. Just a little financial hiccup. We've got it under control." I rounded on him, fury rising. Don't patronize me, Adrian. I heard enough to know you're in serious trouble. What have you done? The brothers exchanged a look of panic. Tara, please, George begged. We can't talk about this now. It's complicated. Complicated? I laughed bitterly. You're discussing illegal activities in our kitchen at midnight. I think I deserve some answers. Adrian stepped forward, his charm cranked up to maximum. Look, Tara, I know this seems bad, but I promise you, we're handling it. Just give us a little more time. I shook my head, disgusted. Time for what? To drag George deeper into whatever hole you've dug? To risk our family's future on one of your schemes? George reached for me, but I pulled away. Don't touch me. I want the truth now. All of it. The silence stretched between us, thick with tension. Finally, George spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We owe money to some dangerous people, Tara. A lot of money, and if we don't pay soon... He trailed off, but the implication was clear. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. How much? When George named the figure, I thought I might faint. How? I gasped. How is that even possible? Adrian stepped in. It started small, just a few bets here and there, but then we tried to win it back, and things escalated. I turned to George, tears stinging my eyes. You promised me you'd stopped gambling. You swore to me, George. He couldn't meet my gaze. I'm sorry, Tara. I never meant for it to go this far. As the full weight of their deception crashed over me, a horrible thought occurred to me. The pawn shop receipt, I said slowly. What did you sell? The guilty look that passed between them confirmed my worst fears. What did you sell? I repeated, my voice rising. George's answer shattered what was left of my world. Your grandmother's jewelry collection. In that moment, I knew our family would never be the same again. The revelation about my grandmother's jewelry was the final straw. The next morning, I confronted George in the kitchen, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. I want Adrian out of this house. Today. George's eyes widened. Tara, please. We can't just throw him out. He's family. Family? I spat. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't lie and gamble away our future. Adrian chose that moment to saunter in, oblivious to the tension. Morning, folks. What's for breakfast? I whirled on him. Nothing. Pack your bags. You're leaving. Adrian's smirk faltered. Come on, sis. Don't be like that. Don't call me sis, I shouted, my control finally snapping. You've worn out your welcome. Get out. George stepped between us. Tara, calm down. We can work this out. Work what out? Ethan's small voice came from the doorway. We all froze, realizing he'd heard everything. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Ethan, honey, go back to your room. Mom and Dad need to talk. But Ethan stood his ground, his eyes darting between us. Are you fighting because of Uncle Adrian? The silence that followed was deafening. George knelt down, reaching for Ethan. Son, it's complicated, grown-up stuff. Ethan jerked away. Stop treating me like a baby. I know something's wrong. You're always arguing, and Dad's never home anymore. My heart broke seeing the pain in my son's eyes. I shot a venomous glare at George and Adrian. See what you've done? Your selfish actions are tearing this family apart. George looked stricken. Ethan, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. Adrian, for once, seemed at a loss for words. I made a decision then and there. Ethan, go pack a bag. We're going to stay with Grandma for a while. What? George exclaimed. Tara, you can't just leave. I stood my ground. Watch me. I won't let you two drag us down with you. Ethan and I are leaving until you sort out this mess. As Ethan ran upstairs, George grabbed my arm. Please, don't do this. We can fix this together. I yanked my arm away. Fix it? How, George? By selling more of our belongings? By getting involved in something illegal? Adrian stepped forward. Tara, listen. I have a plan that could solve everything. No, I cut him off. I don't want to hear any more of your plans. They're what got us into this mess in the first place. George's face crumpled. What about our marriage, our family? I felt a twinge of guilt, but steeled myself. You should have thought about that before you lied to me, before you gambled away our savings and pawned my grandmother's jewelry. Ethan came back downstairs, dragging his backpack. His eyes were red-rimmed, but he looked determined. I took his hand. Come on, sweetie, let's go. As we headed for the door, George made one last plea. Tara, please, don't leave. I love you. I paused, my hand on the doorknob. Without turning around, I said, if you love us, you'll fix this, and when you do, maybe we can talk about coming home. With that, I walked out, Ethan's small hand in mine. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of George and Adrian in the rearview mirror, standing in the doorway looking lost. My heart ached, but I knew I was doing the right thing. This separation might be the wake-up call George needed to break free from Adrian's influence and make things right. As we pulled up to my mother's house, Ethan looked up at me. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" I squeezed his hand, forcing a smile. "We will be, sweetie. We will be." But as I knocked on my mother's door, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long and painful journey. Whatever came next, I knew our family would never be the same again. 2 weeks at my mother's house had done little to soothe the ache in my heart. Ethan was withdrawn, spending most of his time glued to his video games. I'd barely spoken to George, aside from terse text messages about bills and Ethan's school schedule. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to swing by our house to pick up some more clothes for Ethan. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something odd. My car was missing. Heart racing, I fumbled for my keys and burst through the front door. "George?" I called out. No answer. The house was eerily quiet. I climbed the stairs, a sense of dread growing with each step. In our bedroom, dresser drawers hung open, clothes strewn about. George's closet was half empty. My hands shaking, I dialed George's number. Straight to voicemail. "Where the hell are you?" I hissed into the phone. "Call me back. Now." As I paced the room, my eye caught on something poking out from under the bed. I knelt down and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a receipt from a pawn shop, dated just 2 days ago. The item description made my blood run cold. Antique silver tea set. My grandmother's tea set. The one she'd left me in her will. The one I'd been saving for Ethan's wedding day. Fury and panic warred inside me. I stormed down to the basement, praying I was wrong. But when I threw open the storage closet, my worst fears were confirmed. The carefully packed box containing my most precious family heirlooms was gone. I sank to the floor, my mind reeling. How could George do this? How far had he fallen? My phone buzzed, startling me. A text from an unknown number. "Meet us at Riverside Park, 1 hour. Come alone or deal's off." My heart pounded. What deal? What had George and Adrian gotten themselves into? I knew I should call the police, but fear for George's safety held me back. Whatever trouble he was in, I couldn't bear the thought of him getting hurt, or worse. With trembling hands, I texted my mother, asking her to keep Ethan overnight. Then I got in my mother's borrowed car and drove to the park, my mind racing with possibilities, each worse than the last. The park was deserted when I arrived, shadows lengthening in the fading light. I clutched my phone, ready to dial 911 at a moment's notice. A figure emerged from behind a tree. George. He looked haggard, his eyes darting nervously. "Tara," he breathed. "You came." "Where's my car, George? And my grandmother's tea set?" I demanded. He flinched. "I'm so sorry. We needed the money, but it's going to be okay now. Adrian's got a plan." "A plan?" I cut him off. "Like all his other brilliant plans that got us into this mess?" George grabbed my arms, his eyes pleading. "You don't understand. These people, they're dangerous, if we don't pay them back." A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around to see Adrian approaching, flanked by 2 burly men I didn't recognize. "Well, well," Adrian drawled. "The gang's all here." One of the men stepped forward, his hand ominously inside his jacket. "You got our money?" George paled. We're working on it. Just a little more time." The man's face hardened. "Time's up. You know the consequences." In that moment, everything became crystal clear. This wasn't just about gambling debts or pawned heirlooms. My family was in real danger. I stepped between George and the men, my voice steadier than I felt. "How much?" The man named a figure that made my stomach lurch. I took a deep breath, weighing our options. We could run, but for how long? We could go to the police, but would that put us in even more danger? Or I could make one last desperate move to save my family. "I have a proposition for you," I said, meeting the man's cold gaze. "One that will get you your money and keep my family safe." As all eyes turned to me, I silently prayed I wasn't making the biggest mistake of my life. My heart pounded as I crept up the attic stairs, following the muffled voices that had woken me in the dead of night. I'd returned home yesterday against my better judgment, after George had tearfully promised things would change. Now, as I reached the top of the stairs, I realized how foolish I'd been to believe him. The attic door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out. I peered through the crack, my blood turning to ice at the sight before me. George and Adrian were hunched over a large box, my grandmother's antique collection spread out around them. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones. "This should cover at least half," Adrian muttered, holding up a delicate porcelain figurine. George nodded, his face a mask of guilt and desperation. "What about the rest? They won't wait much longer, Adrian." "We'll figure it out," Adrian assured him. "We always do." I couldn't contain myself any longer. I burst through the door, startling them both. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" They jumped apart, guilt written all over their faces. George looked like he might be sick. "Tara, I can explain." "Explain what?" I snarled, snatching the figurine from Adrian's hand. "How you're stealing my family heirlooms to pay off your gambling debts." Adrian stepped forward, hands raised placatingly. "Now, Tara, let's not overreact. We're just borrowing them for a bit. Once we get back on our feet." "Shut up," I shouted, rounding on him. "This is all your fault. You show up here, drag George back into your schemes, and now you're robbing me blind." George reached for me, his eyes pleading. "Honey, please, we didn't have a choice. These people, they're dangerous if we don't pay them." "So this is your solution?" I gestured wildly at the scattered antiques. "Stealing from your own family?" A small voice from behind me made us all freeze. "Mom? Dad? What's going on?" Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. The sight of him, so small and vulnerable, broke something inside me. I turned back to George and Adrian, my voice low and dangerous. "You have until morning to get these things back where they belong, and then you're both leaving, for good." George blanched. "Tara, please, where will we go?" "That's not my problem anymore," I said coldly. "You made your choice." As I ushered Ethan back to his room, trying to soothe his questions and fears, I heard frantic whispers from the attic. I knew in my gut that this wasn't over. The next morning, I woke early, determined to see George and Adrian out. But as I descended the stairs, an eerie silence greeted me. The house felt empty. With growing dread, I checked the attic. The box of antiques was gone. So were George and Adrian. I raced to our bedroom, yanking open drawers and closets. George's things were missing. On the bed lay a hastily scrawled note. "Tara, I'm so sorry. We had no choice. They threatened Eden. We'll make this right, I swear. Please forgive me. Love, George." My knees gave out and I sank to the floor, the note crumpling in my fist. How had it come to this? My husband, a thief in the night, running from dangerous men with my family's treasures. As the reality of our situation crashed over me, I heard Ethan stirring in his room. I had to be strong for him. I had to fix this mess George and Adrian had created. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone. It was time to make a call I'd been dreading, to my old friend on the police force. As I dialed, I steeled myself for what was to come. Our family was in danger, and I was the only one left to save it. My hands shook as I ended the call with Detective Martinez. He'd promised to put out an APB on George and Adrian, but his words rang in my ears. "Tara, you need to prepare yourself. This could get ugly." I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. How had our life come to this? My husband and his brother, fugitives with a box of stolen antiques, running from God knows who. A small hand touched my arm. Ethan stood there, his eyes wide with worry. "Mom, where's Dad?" I pulled him close, fighting back tears. "He had to go away for a little while, sweetie, but we're going to be okay." As if the universe was mocking me, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. With trembling fingers, I answered. "Mrs. Thompson?" A gruff voice sent chills down my spine. "We have your husband and his brother. If you want to see them alive again, bring $100,000 to the old warehouse on Pier 7. You have 3 hours." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in horror, my mind reeling. Where on earth was I supposed to get that kind of money? I called Detective Martinez back, relaying the message. He urged me not to go, to let the police handle it. But I knew in my gut that if I didn't show up, George and Adrian might not make it out alive. "Ethan, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to go to Grandma's for a little while." After dropping Ethan off with my confused and worried mother, I drove to the bank. With a mixture of shame and desperation, I emptied our savings account and took out a second mortgage on the house. It still wasn't enough. With time ticking away, I made a decision that tore at my heart. I drove to the local pawn shop, the same one where George had sold my grandmother's tea set. Tears in my eyes, I handed over my wedding ring and the few remaining pieces of jewelry I had. The dealer's eyes widened as he counted out the cash. "Lady, whatever trouble you're in, I hope it's worth all this." I wasn't sure it was. With barely minutes to spare, I pulled up to the dilapidated warehouse. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pier. My heart pounded as I clutched the duffel bag full of cash. "George?" I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Adrian?" A scuffling sound came from the back, and then they appeared. George and Adrian, bruised and disheveled, flanked by two menacing figures. "Tara!" George's voice cracked. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." Adrian, for once, was silent, his usual bravado gone. One of the men stepped forward, his hand resting ominously on his hip. "You got our money?" I held up the bag. "It's all here. Now let them go." He smirked. "Slide it over, nice and easy." I did as he said, my eyes never leaving George. As soon as the man had the bag, he nodded to his partner. They shoved George and Adrian towards me. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mrs. Thompson," the man sneered. "Let's hope your husband learns to pay his debts on time from now on." As they retreated into the shadows, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. George stumbled towards me, reaching out. "Tara, I stepped back, my voice ice cold. Don't you dare touch me." Adrian piped up. "Sis, we can explain." "Shut up," I exploded, years of frustration and anger pouring out. "You've ruined everything. Our savings, our home, our family. All for what? Your pathetic gambling addiction?" George fell to his knees, sobbing. "Please, Tara, I'll do anything. Just don't leave me." I looked at him, this broken shell of the man I'd married, and felt nothing but a cold, hard resolve. "It's too late, George," I said quietly. "You've made your choice. Now I'm making mine." As I turned to walk away, leaving them both on that dark, lonely pier, I realized that this was just the beginning. The real fight to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my family's future was only just beginning. The morning after the warehouse confrontation, I sat at our kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee in front of me. George slept fitfully on the couch, having begged to come home. Adrian was gone, disappeared into the night like the coward he was. When George finally stirred, I was ready. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady and cold. He nodded, eyes bloodshot and full of shame. "Tara, I held up a hand, silencing him. "No, you listen. If you ever want to be part of this family again, this is how it's going to be." I laid out my terms. Adrian was never to set foot in our house again. George would attend Gamblers Anonymous and therapy. Every penny of our savings and my heirlooms would be accounted for and replaced. "And if you ever lie to me again," I finished, my voice breaking slightly, "we're done. No second chances." George nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'll do anything, Tara. I swear." Just then, Ethan padded into the kitchen, his eyes widening at the sight of his father. "Dad? You're back?" The look on George's face, a mixture of love, shame, and fear, nearly broke my resolve. But I had to stay strong, for all of us. "Ethan, honey," I said gently, "Dad and I need to talk to you about some changes that are going to happen." Over the next few weeks, our lives shifted dramatically. George moved into the spare room, attending meetings every night. I took control of our finances, working extra hours to rebuild our savings. Ethan, my brave, perceptive boy, seemed to understand more than we gave him credit for. One night, as I tucked him in, he asked, "Mom, is Dad going to be okay?" I smoothed his hair, choosing my words carefully. "I hope so, sweetie. He's trying very hard to make things right." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I'm glad you made him stop hanging out with Uncle Adrian. He wasn't very nice." My heart swelled with pride and sadness. "You're right, honey. Sometimes we have to make tough choices to protect our family." As the months passed, I watched George struggle and grow. He threw himself into his recovery, taking on extra work to repay our debts. Slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild trust. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching Ethan play in the yard, George turned to me, his eyes clear and earnest. "Tara," he said softly, "I know I can never undo the hurt I've caused, but I want you to know how grateful I am for this second chance. You and Ethan, you're my whole world." I felt a flicker of the old warmth in my chest. "I know, George. We're getting there, one day at a time." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over our little family, I realized something profound. The crisis that had nearly torn us apart had also given me strength I never knew I possessed. I had stood my ground, protected my son, and fought for our future. Ethan's laughter rang out as George chased him around the yard, their bond slowly mending. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. Our family wasn't perfect. We had a long road ahead, full of challenges and hard work, but we were together, stronger for having weathered the storm. As I watched my two boys, I made a silent vow. No matter what life threw at us next, I would face it head on. I had found my voice, my strength, and I would never let anyone, not Adrian, not George, not anyone, threaten our happiness again. The old Tara, the one who had let others make decisions for her, was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who would fight tooth and nail for her family's well-being. And as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, I felt a surge of hope for our future. We had been tested, nearly broken, but we had survived. Whatever came next, we would face it together, one day at a time.